Hello and welcome to episode 87 of the Ego. Oh man! All right, I will cut that out completely.
Let's just do it
I.
from the top.
Hello and welcome to episode 87 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have quite a few discussion points for this week, including something not directly related to the Call of Duty League. It's actually the Overwatch League, but something that could be very, very important to the future and the health of the CDL. We also have some ROSTERMANIA news finally, some confirmed signings, some that I saw coming, some that I admittedly did not. And we have some other stuff that we will get to at the end of the show. But before we do any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right, been better. Yankees just got swept, but like you said, we got some news to talk about, so that'll change the tides hopefully.
Yankees are doing God's work trying to keep Shohei on the Angels. I don't really know why I want him to stay on the Angels, but that's just my feeling towards it at the moment. And it's always nice when the Yankees get swept. I know you agree with that. Anyway, let's get into some of the topics that we have today, including, and I want to start with this one, even though, like I teased at the top, it is not, on the surface, a CDL or a COD centric story. It's based around the Overwatch League. But this was pretty much the news that broke, right as I was getting up, right after I got up this morning and we were about to start work, that the Overwatch League owners are going to vote at the end of the current season, which it ends in October, early October. So after this current season, the Overwatch League owners will vote on whether to create a new operating agreement to continue to run the league, and maybe change some things, or, and this is a massive question about what they're actually going to do, or they could take $6 million each and finish off the league and be done with it. I think the decision there is pretty clear. I think everyone knows how that decision would go, and that is according to Activision Blizzard's earnings report. So it's not fake news. It's confirmed from the horse's mouth, so to speak, that these owners will be offered $6 million each. I believe the total was about $114 million. Activision Blizzard would be offering the owners as a part of a termination fee, which is concerning, obviously, for Overwatch League fans and esports fans alike. Even though we're not OWL fans, I sympathize very deeply with Overwatch League fans and Overwatch or competitive Overwatch fans, because this is, you never want to see it. You never want to see an entire league, and in this case, the franchised league of an entire competitive scene, likely cease to exist by the end of the calendar year. So what are your thoughts? Because obviously you woke up and you started your work shift at esports.com, and you started your work shift with this news. I don't know if you edited this article, but obviously it was a point of discussion, in Slack, across social media, and I took the angle for one story at least about the Call of Duty League. But how did you react when you heard this news of the Overwatch League potentially being dead essentially by the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, not neither of us are really Overwatch League experts to
Yeah.
any extent. Um, but my general sentiment and what I feel like has been a discussion for a while amongst that community is like the writing that was seemingly on the wall. This kind of seems like not necessarily a get out of jail free, because there was still some money invested into the league, but it seems like a get out of jail for cheaper card, if something to that extent existed.
Pay your way out of
Um,
jail.
I think yeah, I think a lot of the owners, I would be surprised if they weren't thinking the same things in terms of like this is an opportunity to recoup some losses and potentially exit this thing without being in the super red, only being a little red potentially. But nonetheless, all that stuff, CDL related, I really didn't, immediately jump to the conclusion that, this is happening in Overwatch League, or this is happening in the Overwatch League, so it's going to happen in the CDL. Though I think that, could be a possibility down the road. I think Call of Duty esports had a longer history to fall back on as opposed to Overwatch, which, again, not an expert or anything in that regard, but I feel like Overwatch immediately came out, and then very soon after it was released, the franchise league was trying to start. It's not like compared to Call of Duty, which had almost a decade of MLG tournaments and that sort of thing leading up to them. There definitely were MLG tournaments before the OWL. Now I'm thinking about it, because it would have been Vegas 2017. Which would have been IW for COD, was one of the events that I went to. I'm pretty sure it was like COD and Overwatch were happening there, and I just remember it like being off in a side station, kind of like COD was very, 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 very far back in the day. COD was on like a side station, and Halo was the main attraction. It kind of seemed like that was the case at that event, if I'm remembering it correctly. But nonetheless, I do feel like it's, there were some reactions and stuff. There was one caster, I don't remember his name, but Scott wrote an article about some of the comments being shared about people in the Overwatch community saying that it's possible that Overwatch esports could be in a better spot after this is all said and done. And that's possibly one way of looking at it, if they believe the franchise method's just completely dead, and there's another way for Overwatch esports to exist in some form, then that would be interesting to see. But it definitely is something that is going to be in the back of my mind. It might not have been previously, but depending on how it plays out in the Overwatch League, it's definitely something that could happen in the CDL. Hopefully, I selfishly hope it doesn't, and hope the CDL thrives. But got to look at it from all angles in that regard. And similar to what we talked about earlier this year, when there was the report of like the Overwatch franchising fees being waived, or whatever the case was with that, we kind of had a similar discussion around that. Like that hasn't happened for CDL teams. At least it hasn't been reported if it did happen, or it hasn't actually happened for the CDL yet. But is that another sign of things to come for the CDL, or is like the Overwatch League the guinea pig, so to say, and they're testing all these things and keeping the CDL the way it is? I don't really know. I guess there's a lot of different ways you can look at all this, but it's definitely not a I definitely don't. I mean, selfishly, you could look at it from just a CDL fan perspective and say, if the Overwatch League is killed off, maybe Microsoft/Activision Blizzard pours more of those resources used there into the CDL. But at the same time, there are reports today of like 50-ish, I think, layoffs happening in the esports division. So it's really just a tough time for the Activision Blizzard leagues as a whole right now.
That's definitely an argument for kind of the abolishing of something like the Overwatch League or the Call of Duty League, is that we will be better off after these franchise leagues are killed. And I can understand that for sure, because I don't think the competitive Call of Duty is not in any better shape, or if it is in a better shape, it is not a much better shape where it's discernible than it was when it was in the Call of Duty World League, which obviously was Activision backed. It was an Activision league. It was just not a franchise. It was not a closed system. We had the Pro League, but of course, these amateur teams, or whatever you want to call them, they could earn a spot in the Pro League, and the pro teams that pay a lot of money, are the faces of the league, could realistically not qualify. And we saw that a few times. I think like Cloud9 in the first iteration of the Call of Duty World League, back in Black Ops 3, I'm pretty sure they had a team. Maybe Liquid even had a team, but there were a few teams, a few big esports organizations that tried to buy their way into competitive Call of Duty and did not succeed, and ultimately left. And that may be the case again once the CDL is dead or something, or is not a thing in its current form. But I understand the idea that we will be better off after the CDL. At the same time, I think it's a really it's a tough place to be, and that's like the unknown of it all. The fact that if the CDL died, so say the next season of competitive Call of Duty was not the CDL, or it wasn't a franchise system, we just go right back to the CWL. Like, that creates so much mystery about what will actually be happening around these teams, around the contracts that have already been signed, like who's going to actually stay, who's going to come in. And I think the only good thing that has come out of this Overwatch League thing is that there is quite a long runtime for these players, these player agents, the coaches, and all the other staff that could be involved in the Overwatch League, not even to mention the broadcast talent that might not, work with the Overwatch League, or might change based on what happens with the franchise system. But they have about 3 months, give or take, to kind of figure it out by the time that the owners will meet and very likely take that $6 million payout and hit the brakes. And some of those guys that take that money, that own Overwatch League teams, they will never be seen again in esports. They don't want anything to do with esports because it wasn't a profitable endeavor, and they're much rather spending millions or billions of dollars elsewhere and not anything related to esports. Some of those people that will take the $6 million, they will actually stick around. They want to be a part of esports and build a brand. When I love those people to death. Those people are the best. That, despite, okay, we didn't make profit, or we're losing a lot of money, but we're still dedicated to esports. I really respect that, and I think that should be admired by very many people. And I hope that this 3-month gap between when these layoffs are happening, and you were right, it was about 50 people laid off just in the esports department of Activision Blizzard. And I should note that the Microsoft acquisition, the FTC tried to stop it. It didn't work, and I think they're in the process of appealing that right now. But
it got delayed today.
Yeah, so it got delayed, but the idea and the prevailing theory is that it will still happen eventually. And I do believe that this is all in preparation for Microsoft to take over Activision Blizzard, because I don't know if Activision, or that Microsoft is going to be too keen on operating these two franchise leagues that are not receiving franchise money. As far as we know that the Overwatch League teams are not paying any more franchise fees. All of them have been waived as of last month, or they were in the process of being waived. The Call of Duty League, as of last year, the teams owed on average, I think it was like $22 or $23 million on average. So there were teams that owed more than that. That just seems insane to me. And we don't know if they're going to actually pay that or not, or if it's going to happen the way it happened in the Overwatch League, where the fees get waived. Everybody is just like, all right, everybody's even. Let's just push forward or get out. I don't know what's going to happen with that. But yeah, I'm concerned about the future of the CDL, and I am a doom and gloom guy. That's kind of my thing. I'm a pessimistic person by nature, and I wrote this article for Dot, and if any of our listeners or viewers want to go read it, it's called "Should We Worry About the CDL? What the OWL's demise could mean for its sister league." You go to the Call of Duty section on .esports.com to read it. But essentially what I say is that it is almost a certainty that the CDL will eventually die. The timing of it is different, though, because the Overwatch League, if it could die today, I think if the owners could kill it today, I think they would. But they still have 3 months left in the season, or 2.5 months left in the season. So they kind of have to abide by that, and the operating agreement runs until the end of the season. And that's when they would decide whether to kill it or not, and they likely will. The thing with the CDL is it is younger than the Overwatch League, so maybe the operating agreement is for another year or two. I'm not sure how these things work. I don't know if it's a yearly thing. I don't know if it's similar to a CBA. Obviously, there's no player union involved here, but as we've seen in other professional sports, there's a collective bargaining agreement that is approved by the player union and the owners. They come to an agreement that it's essentially a contract, a binding contract between the two sides. And when the contract is up and they have not come to an agreement, that leads to a lockout. And note, I don't think there have been many leagues, at least in modern history, that have just ceased to exist as a part of like those CBA negotiations or when there is a lockout. But the idea does not seem too foreign to me that if an operating agreement or just an agreement in general between the owners to run a league or to operate a league, if they all decide we don't want to do this anymore, then that's kind of the end of it. And I think that will eventually come for the CDL, just because the same issues that the Overwatch League has run into, many of them are being run into by the CDL because they're owned by many of the same people. Robert Kraft is involved in the Overwatch League with the Boston Uprising, and his organization or his company, the Kraft Group, partnered with Oxygen Esports to run the Boston Breach, which came into the CDL before last season. There of course is like Team Envy. I think Envy Optic, whatever you want to call it, but the Dallas Fuel and now Optic Texas. We have a few other that are a part of both, and it really makes me think about like what is going to actually happen when everything hits the fan. And I just think if you bet on it, it's that everything will fall apart as far as and not like fall apart as like, oh, COD esports won't happen anymore. I don't think that's the case, but the idea that the franchises are no longer there and it's more of an open system, more of a wild west, so to speak. Do you agree with that sentiment? That and maybe you don't, and I actually want to get your opinion, but do you agree that we are eventually going to get to the point where the CDL in its current state will not exist the way it is currently?
I think that is fair to say. A cop-out answer to that is potentially the CDL sticking around and just the geolocation aspect being removed, and going back to the roots of just having like Optic, 100
Yeah.
Thieves, that sort of thing. We've talked about that on the podcast before. So to say, is it possible that the CDL won't look the same in the future? I think the answer is yes, and I think maybe not as drastic as you're saying, but at the minimum, I could see that geolocation aspect being removed. But the thing for me too that I was kind of just thinking about as well is that similar to comparing like the history of Overwatch to the history of Call of Duty and just that COD history being richer and stuff is the same thing that for a lot of people I feel like that keeps them coming back to Call of Duty esports, especially in recent years with the games being heavily not liked amongst the community. The thing that keeps people coming back is the personalities, the Twitter drama, all that stuff. And that's not going to go away even if the CDL was to be killed tomorrow, right? Like we would still have some of these guys, even guys like Scump and Octane who recently retired. They've been playing like Apex and stuff together, like and they'd probably be talking smack and having some bannering tweets on the timeline and stuff like that, even if the CDL was to go away. So there's those personalities that have been founded and created over the years in COD's history. That's, in my eyes, a lot of what attracts longtime fans to Call of Duty esports. It's at least in recent years, it is definitely not because of the games themselves, and you can even argue it's a testament to these pro players that they are able to make some of these games as entertaining as they can, despite the roadblocks, is how I'll phrase it, and the position they're put in by some of the development decisions in these recent titles. So yeah, I think it's, I guess, not really playing devil's advocate to the doom and gloom scenario, but I do think change probably is coming to the CDL, but I really want to just stay optimistic that, and maybe it isn't the franchise league, but I just can't imagine my life without Call of Duty esports, and or what would happen in 5 years from now if there just wasn't competitive Call of Duty. So that's really hard for me to think about and actually like visualize and try to imagine what would happen there. Um, but if some scenario like that were to happen, I do think Call of Duty would be in a unique position where it has those personalities to, fall back on and not necessarily rise from the ashes, but it's something that would have people drawn to these people who have been playing the games, and the community would still exist to some extent, even if like every single CDL pro just went to stream on Twitch and was playing all different games. Um, the other thing I will say too is one topic I have brought up on multiple podcasts in the past is just my thoughts on like we really don't have any comparison for as much as esports is compared to sports. We really don't have a good record of the very, very beginning of some of these uh, franchise leagues and traditional sports. Like the thing that I've always said is I would love to be able to sit down and talk to somebody who was not a toddler, but was like somebody who was actually coherent and able to understand what was happening when the NFL and the NBA and those professional leagues were first started. But obviously that is not possible because they're all over 100 years old now, and anybody who was like over 10 years old at the time when those leagues are started is most likely dead, or somebody who potentially was like born right when the leagues were founded isn't going to have any recollection of what was going on at those times. So it's really difficult to compare it to what is happening in these Activision Blizzard leagues, but just gut feeling, I have to believe that there were obviously some sorts of growing pains in all of these other professional leagues too, just getting to the point where they are today. And obviously, the CDL isn't at the point out of these major leagues, but that is, seemingly what Activision Blizzard was hoping the end goal would be for the CDL, the OWL, and that sort of thing. So that's one thing that I really wish there was a way to get a concrete answer to know about all these other things that potentially happened at the inception of traditional sports franchise leagues, but it just feels like there isn't going to, be a really good way to do that. And maybe I have to do more research, and maybe there's some books and stuff written, but you just got to think like it's so hard because so many of those leagues are so old, and they didn't, like I said before too, there's not like a podcast that you can listen to or a YouTube video or anything where people are sitting down talking about the NFL week by week from its first couple years like we do here, right? So that's kind of, my hope for this podcast is at least, we'll have a good history of what's been going on in the CDL ourselves, but I just wish there was something similar for us to be able to compare it to. But yeah, that's just a long-winded way of me saying that I do believe that change is inevitable for the CDL. It's just a question of to what extent.
I love that you brought up and we have brought it up before in the podcast about the old traditional sports leagues, what was happening in the early 1900s in baseball, or what was happening in the 50s and 60s in basketball, and the same in American football. We in esports, because esports is such a new thing, like even the most popular esports are under 30 years old. Like something like a fighting game is probably one of the older ones, or a card game like Magic the Gathering, or you're a big Yu-Gi-Oh guy, like these kinds of card games, like they've been around a while, but they're still so new compared to baseball, started in the 1800s. Of course it's evolved greatly. You wouldn't even recognize baseball in the 1800s versus today. And the same with American football. Like I think it was like Princeton or Rutgers and Princeton or something. It was but that was like one of the first American football games in college football. And it was a completely different sport, essentially, from what we now know to be American football. And the same with basketball. Like I was just reading the other day about George Mikan and how he was so dominant in the 50s, late 40s and 50s, that they introduced the shot clock because of him, and they introduced a larger paint area because he was so dominant that they were like, well, we have to figure it out. Same thing happened with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They just banned dunking because he was so big, so tall, and he had freakishly long arms, so he developed a skyhook because of it. And I just read a book, and I just wanted to brag because I read a book, but it was called Mr. Townsend and the Polish Prince, and it was about a historically black college, Delaware State. They hired the first white head football coach in their conference, and it was obviously a very big deal because it's a historically black college. But they had no weight room, no locker room. All of their facilities, all of the offices for the coaches were really run down and poorly kept. They didn't have very much travel accommodations. They bussed, and they had some really bad experiences. But the idea is that you have to start somewhere, right? And esports, because we're so new, we think we should start where the traditional sports are right now. But that's like saying I want to run when you haven't even learned how to crawl. We don't know any of this. We're so new to this. We have to approach it like it's the 1940s or the 1950s, and we're trying to start the NBA, and we're trying to grow that into what it is now, the NBA, one of the most popular sports leagues in the entire world. And that's something that we have to keep in mind as fans, that we're so new to this. Like, we're on the ground floor, and we're trying to build the building up to be a skyscraper, but right now we're still on the ground floor, and we're putting nails into our hand and to our feet, and we don't know exactly where the blueprints are to this building. We're just trying to figure it out all together, and we should remember that. And hopefully, and this is probably more importantly, the owners and the people that are behind the infrastructure of these leagues, not only the Call of Duty League, not only the Overwatch League, but the LCS, the LEC, the Rocket League Championship Series. Obviously, CSGO has a different format, the same with Dota as well. But the idea is that these people understand that we're just trying to grow it. You can't build it all in a day. You have to just take it slow, step by step, and there will be growing pains. Some organizations will pull out and say, no, we don't want to do that. Those people are there. It's going to happen. I'm sure if you go back to the 60s or 70s, and I'm sure some football team was going to be sold for like $50,000 and a bag of chips or something. And now that same team, even if it's like the Browns or a team that is like so bad consistently, like the Washington Commanders have been. I think the last time they won like 11 games was like 1995 or something. But they sold for like $5 billion, and Dan Snyder's a piece of crap, and he was able to still sell the team for that much money. The idea is like this stuff it's so new. We shouldn't have been charging prospective team owners $25 million to buy into a system that had no proof of concept. Point blank. Like, it was a bad idea to sell it like that. It was a bad idea to buy it like that. Everybody that, Bobby Kotick convinced some of these guys to buy in. Those owners are just as bad because they put so much value that could never be lived up to with that $25 million price tag. Of course, that's a reported figure, not, I don't think any team owner is saying out loud that they spent $25 million on a Call of Duty League team, because I'm sure they don't want to get laughed at by all of their rich buddies. But the idea is that let's just take it slow. If we need to rebuild, we will rebuild. And that was another point you made. Like, COD Esports has such a rich history. We have so many people in this space and beyond that have started in Call of Duty or got their name in Call of Duty and become gigantic successes wherever they are. I look at Fwiz. Fwiz was a COD commentator. He wasn't even, I don't even think he was the top COD commentator at the time, and he ended up being like the head of gaming at Google. We had Golden Boy, who's done TV shows. I know he was on All Elite Wrestling for a bit. He worked for the Titan Games with The Rock. He's done so many things. Hastro has built a successful business within esports, and we have all these other people. Obviously I can't mention them all, but that's the thing about COD is like the players have become successful. The people behind the scenes have become successful. On-air talent has become successful, and the scene itself has not grown to the level that those other people have gone. And I think that's what needs to be looked at. That's how we need to address it. And those are the ways that we can hopefully fix whatever goes wrong with the CDL.
Yeah, and not to take up too much time talking
Yeah.
about this, but just one thing you said to me, or said right there, got me thinking is that, one thing that's always been a talking point in these leagues is viewership. How many hundreds of thousands are you got, or how many tens of thousands do you have if it's low? And the one comparison that's always made is like X event got more viewers than the Super Bowl. And it's like, the Super Bowl didn't become the Super Bowl in the sense of what it is today, just overnight. It took years to get to that point of having the Super Bowl. So even comparing the Super Bowl, what is it now, 55, 54 was the last one, whatever it is, however many. Comparing like the 10th League of Legends World Championship to 50 something, the 50th 55 plus Super Bowl is like, there's a large gap there between how many of each of those tournaments there have been. And, like you said, Rome wasn't built in a day, and, you can't really expect these leagues to be built up to the comparison of these traditional leagues just overnight. And I think that's just something the community maybe as a whole didn't really, I don't want to say understand, but it felt like to me that over the years, and it still does, that people love comparing the viewership numbers to even other esports that have been around longer or are just more popular in other regions of the world and stuff like that. And it's like, end of the day, my feeling has always been like, if you like what you're watching, you're going to keep watching it. If you don't, you're going to go watch something else. So I just wanted to add on to that I feel like that's one talking point to the extension of like, it felt rushed in the sense of many people involved or in the community expected these franchise leagues to just, take off and literally become the NFL, NBA of their respective video games overnight. And I don't think that was ever going to be the case. And, even with something like League of Legends, it takes a long time to get to that point where even it's so popular just in other countries around the world. And it's going to take time for even a game as popular as Call of Duty. There's always been that disconnect between the casual community and the competitive community. And there's so much potential for the league and competitive to tap into, but it's just never really happened to the extent that people thought. So end of the day, we could probably talk about this for a long time, but I think the best, maybe not the best, but just summarizing it is it really does feel like change is coming for the CDL. It's just a question of when.
Yeah. To illustrate your point, 1967 in January was the first Super Bowl. It was 24.4 million viewers. Of course, there were only like 3 channels back then, so there's a pretty good chance that somebody was watching the TV. So that was 24.4 million viewers in 67. In 2023 or in 22, it was 112 million. So it grew quite a bit. Nearly 100 million more people watching. And that's a lot of years, and the NFL is particularly popular in America. It's kind of ridiculous how much more popular it is than every other sport in this country. So it's a very hard, and Call of Duty is not the NFL. Like, Call of Duty is like the MLS or something. It's even though we're not big soccer guys, but that's more of an apt comparison. But let's move on to another topic. Of course, we will probably talk about something related to the Call of Duty League and kind of the future of it multiple times this offseason, and Hopefully there is a next CDL season that we can talk about, but I'm sure there will be more developments, especially as the Overwatch League thing comes to a head. Let's talk about some ROSTERMANIA stuff because that is actually Call of Duty League related. The first of which we'll talk about is Slasher and Priestahh signing with the Boston Breach today. A pretty shocking, seems like over a little exaggerated, but a surprising signing in that Priestahh just announced that he was parting ways from the New York Subliners yesterday. We knew from the reports that that was going to happen based on reported contract negotiations falling apart. We knew that Slasher was departing Atlanta FaZe. He confirmed that, or they confirmed that a few weeks ago. So we knew that those guys were going to be free agents, but it was a matter of where they were going to go. There were rumors that they were a team of two together, but they were just looking for a team, and now they have found one in the Boston Breach. So Slasher and Priestahh with Boston. We're adding in Snoopy, who was confirmed as part of the roster earlier this offseason. And no Kremp, because the Breach parted ways with Kremp a few days ago, announced that he would be an unrestricted free agent. So that leaves Slasher, Priestahh, Snoopy, and presumably our boy Beans, because he's the only other player for Boston that ended the season with Boston that has not announced that he is a free agent. That seems to be the team. It might change. There's always the possibility that Beans would start on the bench or he ends up getting released. It's not confirmed or anything, but that seems to be the direction that they're going to take it. So what do you think about Boston as we see it right now? For sure we have Slasher, for sure we have Priestahh, and for sure we have Snoopy. What's your read on that roster?
Yeah, I like the trio. The idea of Priestahh and Slasher reuniting after the success on their 100 Thieves days, that's pretty exciting. I literally got to see Slasher win a championship this year in Boston too. So if that happened in a Boston home crown with him representing Boston, that would be really cool to see. Despite my feelings for traditional Boston sports fans or sports teams, but nonetheless, I think the roster wouldn't really make as much sense to me if it were to be Beans as that fourth. I feel like we've seen Priestahh just play multiple roles over the years, and I think we've talked about the as ironic as it is, the flexibility of flex players being such a crucial component of forming rosters in the offseason when you don't know what the game is going to be like that you're playing on the next year. So the signing of Priestahh does give you that flexibility. If it is like a 3AR game, you could have Slasher, Priestahh, and Beans in theory on 3 ARs, and then Snoopy is the one sub, and that would be pretty, that would seem like a decent squad on paper. But at the same time, if it's a heavy sub meta, you could potentially sign another sub player and then have Priestahh as your third sub, and he's still going to get the job done in that role as well. So I feel like Boston would benefit from potentially going after another young sub, and maybe not even a young sub to that extent, but just a sub player to pair with Snoopy, have Priestahh on the flex, and then Slasher on the main AR. But we'll see what happens throughout the rest of the offseason. But I think this is a pretty good starting point for the Boston Breach. I don't remember off the top of my head like the timeline of when they signed other players. Last year at least with like Awakening, but obviously the year before that, in their inaugural year, we talked heavily on the podcast about them being in that position based on the very late acquisition of the spot, where they really didn't have an opportunity to be proactive in the offseason. They kind of had to pick from the scraps, as we were saying it. And that is obviously not the position they're in right now. They are being proactive in this offseason, and they're actually one of the first teams to officially announce the signing of 3 players. So that is definitely good to see, at least in my eyes, from Boston. I will be interested to see how they round out this squad. But I think obviously Snoopy has some potential, and having a super solid veteran AR like Slasher to kind of mold and teach him, even more than what he already knows. That should benefit Snoopy in the long run and the sake of his career. So I'm excited to see how that dynamic works. I do think the 4th player will be a crucial element to how this squad rounds out. But we'll have to wait and see, because even like last year, I think I saw like a video from the Subliners or something like that, where they were it might have been D-Real talking about like the coaches poll at the beginning of the season, like was lowly ranking the Subliners, and then obviously they come out to be the top team in the CDL this past season. So the early perceptions and stuff like that can obviously be skewed in the long run. But just what we have right now on paper, I think this is a decent trio. But I will be interested to see how they round it out.
I think the real interesting report, and obviously this is probably a few weeks old now, was that Boston was pursuing Ghosty and that he did not ultimately sign with them. But I think he would work well. I think he's obviously a great player, and it's kind of hard to decouple the success that Optic had over those 3-4 months or whatever it was, with him in the roster after the retirement of Scump and the benching of Illy. If and obviously I think he's probably going somewhere else, but that I think that would have been an interesting pickup for Boston. And but I also just think that Boston is probably, if the last few seasons are any indication, they will probably field at least a few academy players or have a few substitutes along the way. How that works out, we'll see. We could get Doug Sensor Martin back in the mix, and he could be either just grooming all these guys to become starting players, or maybe one day he'll get his shot and debut in the CDL. You were saying that they could use another sub player, and he doesn't necessarily have to be young, but a certain national champion from over a decade ago certainly would suffice in some way or the other.
I think it was Breaking Point. I'm going to look right now, but they tweeted a picture of that AW FaZe team with Sensor, Slasher, Aches, and Apathy, and something like they've won together before or something like that. So, is it on Breaking Point? I definitely saw it, but I don't remember where I saw it now.
That's still a shocking team that was able to even get to a LAN event. I would have definitely expected them to rage quit out of Discord immediately through
It's
one
not
map
on
and
Breaking Point,
scrims.
so I don't know where it is, but yeah, that's one of the greatest stories of all time, really. Aches with the stitches in his hands, beating Optic in 2 series in the grand finals. You just don't see that anymore.
Yeah. Well, the story was that he punched, what was it, like a fire extinguisher or something?
Yeah, I don't remember what it was.
I might be misremembering, because I think Amari Stoudemire punched a fire extinguisher when he's with the Knicks, and he tore up his hand, and he did not go out and play. So obviously Aches greater than Amari Stoudemire. But Patty P is a legend that nobody could hold up to, but X-Defiant guy, so we're not going to talk about him on the Ego Chall podcast until at least it releases and they replace the CDL, and then we'll turn into an X-Defiant podcast. Anyway, we should get I don't know if we really have anything else on Boston. I think it's an interesting roster. It's really hard to gauge what they're going to do, because there was not a lot of expectations for Priestahh coming into this year, and he obviously was a part of a championship roster and a team that despite having a few rough patches near the middle, they started the season really strong and they finished it even better and ended up winning a world championship. Slasher had a really great season in 2022, and this year obviously a lot of expectations as a part of the Atlanta FaZe roster, and I think individually he didn't have a bad season or anything, but they did not end up performing to the point that they thought they would. I think they got 4 third-place finishes this season. They got a second as well, and then of course the Boston major that you went to, they got first. So definitely not a bad season, but based on what Atlanta FaZe has come to expect, it was a disappointment for them, especially with a third-place finish at Champs, and that leads him to Boston. The next roster mania stuff that we should talk about involves the Toronto Ultra, who officially announced that Envoy, the former LA Thieves player, has signed in Toronto, and he actually threw out the first pitch at the Blue Jays game tonight. I don't know if you saw that.
I did.
A tad bit outside, I would say, but he definitely hit the batter on that one. But I want to get your thoughts on that. What do you think about Envoy? Of course, we don't know for sure what the starting roster will be for Toronto. Logic would dictate that Scrappy will be back, and you would think that they would kind of run it back with Insight and Kleenex and just replace Hixie with Envoy and see how things go. But what do you think of Envoy joining the Toronto Ultra?
Yeah, I said it to you in Slack earlier today. Like, we don't know for sure if Kleenex and Insight are actually staying on Toronto. Based on Kleenex's tweet today of the Envoy announcement, it seems like it's likely at this point, but there were definitely some rumblings earlier in the offseason that it potentially Insight and Kleenex might be departing, and Toronto was looking to like build around Scrappy. But if the squad is Scrappy, Kleenex, Insight, and Envoy, I am extremely excited to see the squad compete. I said it numerous times last offseason and even early in the season last year how excited I was for the sub-duo of Kleenex and Standy. I am even more excited now for the potential sub-duo of Kleenex and Envoy. I think not to discredit Hixie, because that is something we've kind of touched on in past podcasts and stuff, but my viewpoint of it, of Hixie and his play style, has always been like, if he was in a role to go negative but facilitate for his team and set the stage for the stars like Kleenex and Insight and Scrappy to just go off and do what they got to do to win games, then Hixie is doing his job. And I think that's just the same type of mindset Envoy has, but Envoy is, obviously a world champion now. And I don't think it's, ludicrous to say that Envoy is a better player than Hixie. So I think it's an upgrade, and, I just would be really excited to see how Envoy and Kleenex work together. Now, the big thing, though, is like I was saying, I was excited about that Kleenex and Standy duo. Obviously, it didn't really work out for them. They were able to bring in Hixie, kind of salvage it, and make win a major, make the champs make the finals champs. So is my excitement for a potential Kleenex and Envoy duo going to end up the same as the Standy and Kleenex duo, or is this going to be one that actually plays out well for Toronto in the long run? That's the question for me.
It's always hard to figure out these rosters because, of course, like you said, you think that Envoy is better than Hixie, and I would agree with that. But talent or perceived talent does not equal better results. And we've seen that time and time again. The Minnesota roster this past season is a really good case study for that, because everything fell apart for them when even if my expectations of them being a championship contender are too high, they were not a team that should have limped into the playoffs. It wasn't that team with the roster they constructed in the preseason. That was not a team that should have been fighting for 8th place and in jeopardy of losing 8th place. And I think they ended up getting 7th heading into champs, but then did not win a match at the Call of Duty League Championships. So like that to me is it's indicative that like just because you have more talent or you have more slaying power, just like what people perceive to be what it makes to be a better player or a better team, that is not always the case. And I think the chemistry is just such a big part of it, and we don't get a view into that most of the time. We don't get to see these teams in practice and how they interact with each other. Like with Toronto last season, I didn't know that there were any issues between Standy and Scrappy, and or Standy and the other Toronto Ultra guys, because that's not a public thing. But then you see that there is an issue, and then they immediately win. I believe it was Major 2 or Major 3, but I think it was Major 3, and they ended up winning a major immediately, and then they at the end of the season go to the Grand Finals of Champs, and that's not a discredit to Standy, because it could just be a team by team case. He might be perfect for another team, just not Toronto. And Standy was a very good player for Minnesota when Minnesota won Major 5, I believe it was, in 2021. He came in later in the season, and they had success afterward because of, in large part because of his addition. And I think that it goes to show, just because you have a lot of talent, it doesn't always work out. And another great example of this is the Optic World War II roster with Octane Methods, Scump, and Crim6. That team was atrocious at Champs. They didn't make it out of group play, and that team has 3 of the top 10 best players of all time on its roster. Octane, if you want to name him first, second, or third best AR of all time, like I think Formal and probably Aches to a degree, Crim6 to a degree, Clay obviously, but there are a lot of people that would consider him to be one of the greatest ARs of all time. There's not a lot of debate that Crim6 and Scump are 2 of the greatest players of all time. Zenny he's a good player, but he's not a historic level player, but that team should have been a lot better based on the talent that they had on paper, but it didn't work out for whatever reason. And that's happened before. And even the Optic Dynasty, almost, if they would have lost to Panda Gaming in what was that, 2016 or 2017, they would have broken up. They would have never had the world championship that they did in 2017, but they won that match and they ended up going on to do things. And that just, that goes to show that you are literally, a map away from breaking up a team, or a team just doing what they need to do to get past another team, and they survive. And it's just so the Toronto thing, I think, my head says yes, he will make the team better. They're going to be championship contenders again, but there's also the possibility that they will make a midseason roster change again to bring in someone that maybe fits the team better. It's very hard to tell, especially when those guys probably don't even know for sure how this is going to work out, because you don't really know until you actually get to practice. And we'll see what the meta is like, of course, like what you said earlier with the Boston thing, but the flexibility of flex players is a really big deal, and that can make or break a team, and we'll see how it goes for Toronto. The next thing that we have is not a ROSTERMANIA thing. We actually, I think, got all of the ROSTERMANIA stuff out of the way, but something that was talked about a little bit this past week, I think it was earlier this week, the Los Angeles Thieves. So kind of the brain trust of LAT. It was like Nadeshot, John Robinson, who I think is like the COO of 100 Thieves, and Jacob Toft Anderson, who's the SVP of esports as well. They were talking about it on Nadeshot's podcast, Nadeshot Knows. They had a conversation about essentially the business side of 100 Thieves, and specifically in a good portion of the video talked about the business side of the Los Angeles Thieves. And during that conversation, Robinson just came out and said that the 100 Thieves organization lost $2.5 million on LAT during the 2022 World Championship season. That season, they lost $2.5 million despite winning a major and a $2.55 million CDL champs event. And that number is ridiculous. That is a lot of money to lose. And it does, it's a logical reason for why we are seeing what is happening with the LA Thieves now. They're completely rid of all of the players that they had the last 2 seasons. Draza is likely going to Atlanta FaZe. Kenny's likely going to Optic Texas. Envoy obviously signed with the Toronto Ultra, and Octane retired and became a content creator for the 100 Thieves organization. They're they don't have any players. They just have coaches, as far as I know, JCap and Shane. And they talked about like how they're essentially going to be more financially responsible with this new LAT roster, whoever or whatever it comes to be, and try to mold these young players. I think Nate Shot used the term superstars of tomorrow. That is what they want their young players to turn into. So I want to get your thoughts on this, because we've talked about it before with other teams, maybe not specifically LAT, but the idea of opting for cheaper contracts, cheaper players, maybe developing players. I think this is a theory or something that we threw out there when we were talking about the Paris Legion a few years ago, where maybe it was last year, where they were really bad. And I was saying, why don't they just try to sign young players and then sell them to other teams like a lot of soccer clubs do? Obviously, they went a different direction this season, and it got better results, but I think the idea still stands. And now we're seeing 100 Thieves and LAT maybe go down the same route, and in an effort to be more financially stable and sustainable, they're going with a younger, cheaper roster. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, obviously two very different esports. But just for the sake of comparison, I know for 100 Thieves League of Legends team, they had some really high level people behind the scenes. The first name that comes to mind is Papa Smithy, who, you know, COD fans don't know, but he's a very knowledgeable person in the League of Legends scene. Was a caster for a while. He's a really good caster, and then he was involved with 100 Thieves operations. I don't remember the exact titles, but I think he was the GM for 100 Thieves, and I believe now he's the GM slash president. I think he's president of FlyQuest for League of
I think
Legends.
so.
Um, but regardless of the history lesson, 100 Thieves did a really good job there, developing talent in North America, which is not something that's very easy to do in League of Legends, which is historically dominated by Korean and Chinese teams. So, they've won a few championships in I think two championships in the LCS, and not necessarily with homegrown talent per se, but throughout those years, and now this year they have a support player who was like on their academy level team for a couple of years, and they had a top laner for the first half of this year who was on their academy level team as well. That's a long-winded way of saying that 100 Thieves does historically have success in another esport with developing players and not necessarily seeing that same success at the next level, but they are still, talented players that they were able to find and bring into an academy structure, and help them, refine themselves as players and that sort of thing. So do I think just based on that they can do the same thing in COD? No, not necessarily. But I think of any of the potential teams that could do this, 100 Thieves probably has, at least a mindset or something to look back on and say like, hey, we did XYZ in League of Legends, and maybe we can take some of what we learned there and apply it to Call of Duty. Again, very different games, very different systems and that sort of thing. But especially like you mentioned, like JCap and Shane, those are two very knowledgeable guys in Call of Duty. They've been around the scene for a long time. They have an eye for talent. I think if they were to try to help, maybe recruit or scout young talent and try to build a squad like that, I think they would do a good job of identifying some potential breakout candidates for upcoming, stars in the making. But it's definitely not something that's very easy. And I think the other aspect of this is something we've talked about with Optic in the past. Optic and the Green Wall in particular, the Green Wall always expects first. Anything outside of first is, just not acceptable for the most part. And I feel like LAT fans to a lesser degree have that same mindset. And, it could be that connection there with Nadeshot in the Optic days, although Nadeshot's teams never, not never, but, historically didn't have as much success as teams, like the Dynasty that came after him. But I just think that, LAT is associated as a very popular team, top three in the league with Optic and FaZe in terms of fan, attraction and viewership. So for LAT fans, it might be difficult for them to stomach the idea of having a development squad, but it's not like the same as, we talked about earlier in the episode comparing to traditional sports. Even if you go down this route, it's literally a 4-player team. It's not like, you're the Browns going 0-16 because you just have a bunch of young guys out there and, maybe you got a couple of veterans, but you're tanking. You're objectively trying to lose and get a better draft pick the next year. That's not the same case in Call of Duty esports. There's no draft picks. There's none of that. So, I think it is a little different and could be difficult for some LAT fans to stomach. But I do think as an organization that LAT and 100 Thieves would have some good ideas that they could possibly bounce off of to try and identify the team that they want to build. And I think that, like, with the allure of playing for LAT is something that could help attract more of these, especially if they're trying to pay less than some other teams might be offering. Like someone like Ghosty, let's just say, for example, I could see Ghosty being signed by LAT and them trying to build around him in that regard. Maybe Ghosty would be more inclined to take a little bit of less money to play for LAT as opposed to taking more money to play for like LAG or Vegas Legion, So I feel like the Thieves have that going for them, especially in a year where they seemingly are going to try to spend less money to still produce a winning team. I don't think it'll be an easy task, but I do think there are some good candidates in the Challengers League, and it will be interesting to me to see if they go like legit like 4 rookies, 4 Challengers players, or if they have like a mix mash team of some people we've seen in the CDL and then some rookies. So I am interested to see what route they go down. But it's definitely, just like you said at the very top of this segment, it's just a astonishing number to hear out loud that a team lost 2.5 million in 1 year. And you brought up some points too, like we don't know how like the revenue share from like media rights deals and even like the skins and stuff in game, like we don't know how much all that factored in, and even the prize winnings, like how that is divvied up between the organization and the players. So there's a lot of question marks around how that number got to what it is. For the most part, you got to imagine that it's just basically salary for the 4 players and JCap. And then I think Shane was only a coach for like the last couple months, so that probably wasn't too much money on paper. But nonetheless, it is definitely I think it's good that we got a number like that, because we have speculated about like costs and salaries and stuff like that for a while on the podcast. But to have a number like that, it'd be interesting to see or interesting to hear what some of the other situations are for these similar franchises.
Yeah, I definitely think if we could get a more detailed breakdown of kind of what they're spending on, and or maybe it's not LAT, maybe it's another esports organization or esports team, but just kind of getting an idea of the expenses that go into that might give everybody, fans, media, like just a better idea of kind of the struggles that some of these teams may face just trying to compete in these leagues. Obviously, LAT was not just trying to compete or just not trying to be in the league. They were trying to win, and they ultimately did during the 2022 season. But another point I wanted to bring up was this will be the first off season that Novus, the general manager of the LA Thieves, will get to construct a roster. I looked it up, and I don't know exactly if how involved or what degree he was involved in creating the Seattle Surge roster of the last 2 seasons, because he was announced just a few days before the roster was announced in 2021. But I would imagine that he had extensive or some degree of kind of power in creating that roster, and that was a blend of accuracy, a vet who's been around a while, but had to that point kind of fallen out of favor of like the big teams. You had Mac, who was coming off of his New York Subliners days And I think the last NYSL season for him was not particularly successful, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe it just wasn't. Obviously, it wasn't like pursued. I don't think by the big teams. And then there was Sib and Pred. Sib was part of the Atlanta FaZe Academy roster, at least in 2020. And Pred, if I'm not mistaken, was turning 18 and or 19 or something, and he was obviously coming from the APAC region. So that those are four different situations and four different players that combine to make a very, very strong 2022 Seattle Surge team. They kept that same roster for 2023. The results were not as good, but they still ended up finishing fourth at champs and got to a grand finals of another major, which is a massive improvement over the first two seasons for the Seattle Surge. So, and of course, Novus was not the GM this past season as he left for LAT, and he didn't get to do anything with the roster this past season because they were keeping their World Championship four together. But I'm very excited to see what he's able to cook up, see where he goes with this. I like to act like I'm the GM of some NBA teams and or some NFL teams. I'm like, why don't you just sign him or trade for him? Like it's so easy. But the roster construction for LAT will be very difficult, I'm sure, just based on the financial constraints that they have. And I believe it was John Robinson said that they've pretty much given a mandate to every department within 100 Thieves that they are profitable or break even this coming year. And I think that is, and I think it was in 2024. So, in 2024, the esports department, so not just Call of Duty, but the esports department as a whole in 100 Thieves is supposed to be profitable, or not in the red, essentially. And I think that's going to be a really interesting, hopefully they follow up on it. And I would love to get updates about it next year around this time to see if they were able to achieve that goal. And because we know that profitability is the thing that all these esports organizations are striving for, they're hoping for. They get some kind of profitability to keep these things alive and continue to grow, hopefully. But LAT, that's a team that you would expect to compete for championships because that's the expectation that they put upon themselves since they came into the CDL. And HI even talked about it. He said that it may be refreshing to be the underdog, which is a little bit of copium, but I'll allow him to have it. Just because, obviously, he's saying that because they're not going to be expected to win championships with the roster they put together unless they surprise us and end up bringing together four really talented vets that maybe just aren't making as much money or something, but they're not going out and spending as much money you would presume as some team like Optic Texas or Atlanta FaZe, who are reportedly getting two of the LA Thieves players. But that to me seems to be an interesting angle, and I think that's obviously something we'll talk about as the offseason progresses about what LAT ends up doing with their roster and what direction they take their roster construction in. The last thing is not really a topic, so to speak, but just a gigantic shout out to Accuracy's mom. He announced today that his mom, after a year-long battle with cancer, is now cancer-free. So, obviously congratulations to Accuracy and his family. Cancer is the worst. So obviously just wishing Accuracy and his family well, and congratulations all around to the Iceman's family. I bet she's got some ice in her veins as well. I think that's something he inherited. But yeah, just shout out to her and congrats to them. And that's pretty much it. I don't know if you had anything else to discuss as we wrap up the show.
No, I do think the Novus shout out was a good shout. Will be interesting to see because I feel like I did hear just in the community that he did play a role in the acquisitions of Sib and Pred at that time for Seattle. So you got to think he found two stars there that are going on to sign with potentially two very good teams for next year. So it will be interesting to see if he's able to find success like that again in free agency. And yeah, shout out Accuracy Mom. Will be interesting to see Accuracy situation for next year. Is he a player? Just talking about LAT, is he a potential target for LAT where like he might not have an opportunity with other teams? Would he take like a less contract, less monetary wow, I can't talk, lower salary to stay in the CDL with a team like LAT? And that could be something that actually you know in my head would be something that I feel like I feel like Accuracy and him are good friends. People always talk about the friendship league, but even regardless of that, if they got like Accuracy for a lower salary and then they're able to build three rookies around him, that's kind of replicating the Seattle Surge formula, right? It's just a question of who those rookies are that they would put around him. So maybe that's something to keep an eye on. That obviously has no backing whatsoever, and it's just a thought on the top here of combining the last two topics that we just had together. But that's where my head is at before bed.
Yeah, I wanted to see Clayster just be pretty much the anchor for three rookies just to see how it goes. I don't know if he'd be willing to move out to LA to be a part of LAT because I know that he and his girlfriend are building a house or build a house in I think it's Austin. So I'm not sure how keen he is to uproot his obviously his dogs and everything. Especially because we saw with Octane this past year, he as soon as they lost to in champs, he packed his bags and was on the road back home to Virginia, and it was like, yeah, I can't wait to get out of LA and just go home. Which I think that's something that is kind of interesting to watch as well. Is just some of these guys are probably not gonna be super willing to uproot wherever they're living now to go move to a place that they might not be next year, especially if they're only getting like the minimum. And of course, the salaries, at least rumored, are to be kind of falling and more in line with what the teams want, not necessarily what the players probably would like. And I think that's a big reason why you're seeing like Priestahh having to move away from a championship roster and go to Boston instead of sticking with NY. But that's another thing to watch as the offseason progresses, and we get a little more information as ROSTERMANIA continues. And it seems like tomorrow or probably today, when you're listening or watching this, we'll have the Atlanta FaZe roster announcement. FaZe is announcing it on Zuma's channel on his Twitch stream. And it's expected to be Draza. The reports are that it's Draza, which will be a very interesting and that might be the most interesting roster of all, just from the personalities at play and the history between them. But we'll probably talk about it. Yeah,
if that move gets announced on July 20th, and whenever you're listening to it, if you're listening to this before July 20th, and this news happens, the Draza signing is confirmed after you're listening to this, just do me a favor and head over to .esports and check the Call of Duty section for the article on the move, like I said, if it is confirmed, because we were talking earlier today, and I think we got a pretty interesting headline cooked up for that one if it is actually confirmed, and I really like where we're at with that. So I think our story will have a little bit different components of it. I don't want to say anything else and spoil it, but definitely, yeah. If you're a fan of Atlanta FaZe or Draza, and that move is announced on July 20th, or whenever it's announced, or whenever you're listening to this, just head over to .esports and keep an eye out for that article on the move, because I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Yeah, they better not swerve us and announce that.
Clay.
I don't know, like Ben's coming in the roster.
That'd be tragic.
Whoa. Shots fired at Ben. Hashtag when. But I think that about does it. I think we covered quite a bit. Obviously, most of this episode, or about half of this episode, was covering the OWL stuff and kind of how it relates to the CDL. And maybe for the next pod, we will have an update or some kind of progression in that story. Something that I honestly really was like not weighing on me. I feel like that's just such a dramatic way to say it, but obviously it was just on my mind as soon as I saw it this morning, and of course that played into a big part of our conversation here. So let us know what you thought or think of the move, or what you think of the show and as a whole. Obviously the off season stuff is not as like regimented and as consistent in the conversations as the in season ones, because we have matches to talk about and all that good stuff during the season that just not around in the off season, and that's why the schedule has been a little weird. And in this week in particular was kind of weird just because I'm going home, and it's kind of throwing off the schedule, and just a weird time in the off season. Everything is kind of moving and shaking, and even the Ego Chall podcast, its schedule is moving and shaking as well as we get through the off season. But hopefully we will be back next week, if not 2 weeks at most, and we'll give you an update on whatever's going on. Obviously, the Atlanta FaZe stuff likely will be announced by the time that you listen to or watch this. So we'll probably talk about that at some point. And then if anything else happens, we'll be making sure to come back and talk to you, and you should come back and listen to us and give us all of those great listens on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or the views on YouTube, which continue to blow my mind how relatively popular the YouTube channel is, considering neither one of us are very popular people. We're not like losers or anything, but we're not the cool kids at the party. We're kind of standing in the side of the room, maybe playing beer pong, but definitely not socializing with a ton of people. I'm getting a little off track now, but I still think I still think you should listen to the Ego Chall podcast, subscribe to it on YouTube, all that kind of stuff. And we'll be back next week, hopefully. And you can check out Bink on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Preston Byers. And the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. And yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, just a little side note there. I think we did luck out a bit, because I would have been pretty pissed off if we did the podcast yesterday and then Boston and Toronto announced the signings today. That would have been, par for the course for what has happened in the past with the Ego Chall podcast. But I think we lucked out this time by holding off and doing the show tonight. So, all that aside, thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show, because I know we definitely had a bit of an animated discussion at the beginning there, and we had some good talking points, I feel like, throughout the entire show. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys as always for all the support, and remember to send the chow.